Good afternoon and welcome to tomorrow's Tropics for 2022. Please note, I am not a meteorologist and this video is just a collection of my thoughts and opinions about seasonal conditions that we were looking at. And this is not in any way official. And even though the forecasts made in June are better than, say, in April, there's still a reasonable degree of uncertainty, and you shouldn't take this as gospel. And take it with a grain of salt because things can still change before I get to peak season when these conditions really do matter. So let's first take a look at this SST map. So this is a pretty good way to take a look or get a look at things in June. Of course, it's not going to look like this during peak season, but it's a good way to kind of get a general look at the big picture at this point, because at this point you can kind of tell the general things that we'll be looking at going into the hurricane season. So let's take a look at the major SST patterns here. Here's a negative PDO, so that's gonna probably keep the Pacific side quiet this season, and that means less shear for the Atlantic. So that's one favorable thing about it. Then there's the La Nina pattern, and these kind of acting in tandem again is going to keep the Pacific quiet. Not much TC activity, less convection than usual. So we're going to have less outflow coming from the Pacific, and that's going to probably keep shear lower. Coming from the Pacific at least, for the Atlantic. And at the same time, this is probably going to keep a lot of sinking air over the Pacific. Again, that's going to be favorable for the Atlantic because if you have sinking air here, usually you tend to have sinking air in a lot of the eastern hemisphere, which tends to favor rising air over here, more easterly winds, and generally lower shear. So the Pacific looks quite favorable. Then looking further west, you look at the kind of Indo-Pacific warm pool. It's very warm, as you'd expect with La Nina. It's actually a bit warmer than you expect. It's very amplified, especially comparing to, say, 2020. And that may cause a negative Indian Ocean dipole to form in the coming months. Hasn't quite materialized, but it seems likely given all the heat that's bunched up all the way here. Then the Atlantic, it looks a lot better than it did in April, but it's not quite there. We'll get to that later because that's really the main mode of uncertainty right now. And last but not least, here we got the South Atlantic. It's a little warmer than normal, but it's a good bit cooler than 2020 or 2021. So it's going to be make it easier for us to get a positive Atlantic meridional mode, which may allow the ITCZ to climb a bit more north, which would favor a more active season. So let's first take a look at the ENSO state. And again, we are in the La Nina. It's very entrenched. The subsurface is the one thing that's kind of trying to kind of push against the La Nina, but it's probably not going to have a very good time with that. There is this large warm pool, and a couple times that's tried to come up and surface, but the problem is there's so many easterly winds, and the easterly wind bursts are so persistent that it hasn't been able to get much of anywhere. You kind of get like a piece usually kind of break off, try to surface but weaken, and it weakens this kind of signature at the surface, and we've actually seen that over the past couple of weeks, but it doesn't do a whole lot other than weaken it to a cool neutral territory, and so it's not enough to get us to El Nino, not even close. All it's really going to do is maybe keep us from getting a very strong La Nina, maybe keep us at weak to moderate La Nina. So it might limit how strong it is, but we're going to stay in that negative ENSO. So it's not it's pretty high confidence at this point. And if we look at the ENSO models during peak season here, not a single model has El Nino. Generally, it looks like cool neutral or La Nina. That's favorable for the Atlantic as it means less shear and less Pacific convection. it's not really worth spending a whole lot of time on this, given how confident we are in it. Let's move on. So next, let's take a look at the West African monsoon here. And this too looks pretty similar to April in that it's probably going to be strong. And you can see this kind of area, which notably the National Hurricane Center has actually taken a look at in the past to kind of gauge activity and, or even, I think it even does it now, or at least NOAA does, with the hurricane season, and how cyclonic this area is, and how strong the easterlies are in this kind of area. That goes in their forecast. So depending on how it looks, it could support a more or less active season. And so far, we have very, very weak easterlies off Africa here, and kind of getting a little bit into Africa, and pretty strong easterlies to the north of that. So westerlies in this region here tend to correlate to more active hurricane seasons as it kind of slows down the flow here, allows waves to get going, or allows waves to get going more at the westerly flow. And then looking a bit north, you have very cyclonic flow, and that again is also correlated to more active seasons as it really allows waves to get going. It provides a bit of extra vorticity, and so it helps them spin up. And yeah, this is basically the same sort of pattern that we've seen in the past few years. And perhaps we might get those messy monsoon troughs. Then again, the negative Indian dipole, it does look negative. That might kind of discourage Africa from being so dominant and strong, like has been the past few years. But with something this strong, we might run the risk of something like that kind of messy monsoon trough mode coming up sometime during the season. But we'll see about that. And one thing about this area too is it does somewhat get into lower levels, so it does kind of weaken the trade winds there, and that allows the main development region in this area, or the southeastern North Tropical Atlantic, it allows it to warm up due to the weakened westerlies. And we've seen that happen basically every season for the past several years, and it doesn't seem that it's going to be stopping now. And looking at the precipitable water, generally most of Africa looks moister than normal. Not really a surprise given how we're likely going to be having a strong West African monsoon. So that means more moisture for waves that would support more convection and basically contribute to a more favorable look. And now to get into a bit of the more uncertain sort of stuff. So here's the springtime sea level pressure anomaly plot. So from April 1st to June 5th, just a couple days ago. And you see this big, huge low here dominates the subtropics. And that's because of the negative NAO that kind of came about midway into April. And that has actually been a major factor in the seasonal forecast. If you kind of notice the way discussions kind of change over time, that's because of this, because that has made us go from that kind of active but not quite hyperactive look that we've been in for a lot of the spring to a lot more discussion and talk about perhaps a potentially hyperactive season. And if you look at this next map, which is the April to May pattern of every hyperactive season since 1995, it does look pretty similar in the Atlantic. You do have this large low weakening the surface ridge in the subtropics, and usually because of a negative NAO. The one big issue, though, is 2022. It's a little farther north, and that I think that explains kind of one thing that's keeping us from being very, very confident, like say 2020, that we're going to be having a hyperactive season. more that it looks more likely than not we'll have, or we might have one. But there's definitely a big fail mode. And yeah, I think this being a bit further north kind of might explain that, and that's a potential way that season might be a bit less active than forecast. And kind of to as a comparison, here's the active but not quite hyperactive seasons since 2010, and you see it's very different pattern. It's not really similar at all. So we're definitely a lot closer to the hyperactive composite, but not quite there. So rolling forward to August to October, so that's the peak season. In the hyperactive seasons, you can see why they're hyperactive because you have this low pressure here, basically right near the tropics. It's centered just north, but with that, you get low pressure in the tropics and weak trade winds on the southern side of that. That's a very favorable looking pattern, and in here it allows more spin ups and stronger, longer lasting cyclones down in the deep tropics, and those kind of really rack up, say, the accumulated cyclone energy count, and that's why they're hyperactive. Now, looking at the not quite hyperactive seasons, they are active, so they are supported by some degree of low pressure in the deep tropics, but you see that the low pressure is centered a lot further north, and it's really more in the subtropics. And so you have more instability up here and less down here, and so you have some mild stability problems in the deep tropics, and that kind of puts the brakes on those kind of seasons a little bit. And I could see that happening this season, potentially, given the way things look. Taking a closer look at the SST pattern, you see this horseshoe pattern. So that's like the positive AMO, but it's not quite where you'd expect it if you were, say, in a hyperactive to be season, because usually you'd expect it to kind of curve down here and get into the deep tropics, but it stops at the subtropics. And then if you look south of that, the main development region isn't quite like cold or anything, but it's cooler in the subtropics, and so that means they're going to kind of compete for convection more so and stability, and you tend to get more unstable conditions over here in the subtropics and less stable or less unstable conditions in the deep tropics. And so what you'd get is struggles with convection, weaker cyclones down here while there's stronger ones up here, and at times perhaps a stronger upper trough in the region, as you kind of have ridging up here from TCs and perhaps kind of shearing the deep tropics. But the main thing is kind of less stability if this kind of keeps going. And looking at how this is further north than the hyperactive type of look, maybe it's not a surprise that you tended to have those warm anomalies that in a hyperactive you're set up in the tropics instead set up in the subtropics. And again, this is the main mode of uncertainty, because if we do stay here, that might mean all those kind of high-end forecasts we've been seeing might bust low. And we'll see, though, because there is some confidence we might kind of shift a bit into that pattern where the tropics dominate a little more based on a few things. But in the near term, probably not, because, the next 10 days, trade winds dominate over the tropical Atlantic. So that is probably not going to help this get warmer much at all. But we'll see what happens, because really the one big thing that we also look at, climate models, they're very, very gung-ho on the season. Some of them were just going totally insane. And basically what they seem to have happen is in the next couple of months, you have this much of the subtropics, aside from this kind of warm blob up here, and you kind of have the subtropics over here cool down, and then you have the bottom part of this horseshoe emerge, and the tropics become dominant and the warmest part of the basin. Or the kind of warmer area here. And this also occurs earlier on the CFS model here, but generally what climate models do is they warm up the MDR with those weak trade winds and cool down the subtropics. And if we do have that, that would support, that'd be like the funnel piece basically, and that would pretty easily support potentially hyperactive season. And that's why a lot of these models are so gung-ho on the season, just because it looks very, very favorable if you can get something like that. But there is a potential for that to bust. So if we do see the MDR keep cooling and it doesn't really rebound by July or August, then we'll be talking about, perhaps it being less active than perhaps thought in the past. Now, otherwise, things look quite favorable, and that's thanks to the global circulation. Because basically the most unfavorable thing here is the Atlantic SST pattern, and the kind of struggles with the instability that could happen in the deep tropics. So we'll see if those verify, but in general, the global circulation very favorable, and so what we'll get with that is a very strong upper ridge, and on the underside of that, easterly winds. So that means less shear. That is generally widely forecast in climate models. You can see here the actual zonal wind anomalies. So this is a lot of widespread easterly anomalies. So less shear than normal for this basically entire area. So any deep tropical cyclone would have a pretty good time in here dealing with not quite as much shear as normal, except perhaps right off Africa where the normal shear is already easterly. And looking at the entire global circulation, so here is divergent upper level air, and so that's rising air. Here's convergent upper level air, so that's sinking air, and that's a pretty good look for the Atlantic, because if you have this sinking air over the Central Pacific, you generally don't have a whole lot of outflow into the Atlantic, and so it keeps shear low. And when you have Indian Ocean MJO, or just Indian Ocean rising air because of the bay state, then you get more easterly wind, and it tends to favor increased TC activity. So the global circulation looks quite favorable, and that's one reason why hyperactive season is possible. And yeah, really the main piece missing is the actual Atlantic SSTs, which could perhaps evolve towards something more favorable, but we shall see. And despite whatever happens here, the climate models are also quite gung-ho, and precipitation probably in the deep tropics and going up north, so perhaps a lot of strong waves or TCs in the deep tropics here, starting in perhaps some activity in that kind of warmer area over here where SSTs are high, but these precipitation forecasts are always kind of a bit variable. So we'll see what happens. The only thing I'm really super confident in, I think, would be a bit of a northward shifted ICCZ here, and a strong West African monsoon, which is both widely shown in climate models. And looking at the North American multi-model ensemble, so similar model, you can see they both agree on kind of this sort of area. Big difference is the Caribbean. We'll have to see if we do get these precipitation anomalies in here or if we don't. I mean, the way things look, it depends on the ridging, I would guess. But I mean, if there's a strong enough ridge, I could see the Caribbean being a pretty favorable area for TCs tracking through. So I guess it really comes up to the ridging strength. The CFS model here, which does show a reasonably strong ridge. So I mean, it could cause land impacts, but I mean, it is June. It's way too early to really seriously be looking at that. But we'll see if it kind of steers TCs here in the Caribbean, or maybe they, like they have in the recent years, they maybe curve a bit north before getting there. But we'll see. That's not really something we should focus on too closely right now, because forecasting where storms hit is kind of a crapshoot until we actually have a storm and we actually have a steering pattern. But again, we'll see. So with what we know, I'm going to be forecasting 18 to 20 named storms, 9 to 11 hurricanes, 6 of those being major hurricanes, and accumulated cyclone energy index of 150 to 180. So it's a pretty active looking season so far. We'll see if those fail modes do come to pass, and maybe we see something less active, or we see the climate models do verify and head towards a more likely hyperactive season. But we have some time to watch for those trends, and by July we should definitely know a good bit more. In the meantime, it is June 7th or June 8th if you're watching. I'm going to be uploading this, and that is past June 1st, so we are in hurricane season now. So if you aren't already seasonally prepared, it's probably a good time before storms really start spinning up to get prepared for any possible seasonal impacts. Be prepared for a storm well before it hits. Have your supplies that you can have beforehand, so that you aren't panicking if a storm hits your area, and that takes off a lot of stress if there's a potential storm. And no matter how active the season is, if it is hyperactive or even if it's somehow inactive, it only takes one strong storm for in your area to be a bad season for you. So no matter what the forecast is, do be prepared before this season or a storm potentially hits you. Otherwise, tropics aren't we're pretty quiet right now to talk about. If you enjoyed this forecast, if you have any questions, comments about it, please let me know. Thanks for watching.